Natives. Oh, good evening, everyone. I'm so excited for tonight. You already know what it is. We have a wonderful guest today, and we have another launch by one of our esteemed authors. And so we're really excited to be in conversation with Futhi Ntshingila. How are you, Futhi? How are you, Tloki, even though we speak like 5 times a day?
Hey Alma, I mean it's always good to be in conversation with you here, and then yesterday and the day before yesterday and this morning. But I'm really excited because we have another book launch. It feels like my life has been consumed with like cheeky natives, and then
Mm.
the work that I'm supposed to do to earn a living, right? So maybe whoever's out there, if you want me to earn a living this way, like I just need like 60,000 a month to live, and then we will be fine. So you can pay me
I
60,000 to
don't
read
want
it.
to be too conservative. I don't want to be too conservative. I'll take 200,000. I think that will just help me to buy all the books that I need, to read all the books that I need, to have all the conversations that I need. Just 200,000. I was just putting it in.
And so today we're going to have the author of They Got to You Too, and I'll just give Alma the opportunity to read the bio, and then after that we will welcome Futhi in a cheeky natives manner.
Sure. Okay, give me 1 second. I have the extreme pleasure of introducing Futhi Ntshingila, who is a writer from Pietermaritzburg. She's the author of 2 books besides this one called Shameless and Do Not Go Gentle. And her work centers on women and marginalized communities. Futhi holds a master's degree in conflict resolution and currently lives and works in Pretoria. And she is the author of And They Got to You Too, a novel.
And I just want to say, Wabana Rona, the cheeky natives, we are so advanced. When you see here, it proof copy, right? So it means we're advanced. We're still the copy that is going to be out, we're yet to receive. Marona proof copy, right? And that's really important just to see the stature, our stature of where we are. We must be prepared before everyone else, right? But welcome, Futhi, so much. It's interesting because your bio says her work centers on women and marginalized community. But I think in many instances, this book is a little bit different from, let's call it Shameless and Do Not Go Gentle. And I suppose the first question that we have for you is why this book, right? Like, why this story? Particularly at a time that we live in, why this book and why this story?
Yeah, it's an idea that I had for a while, and it was going in line with the Shameless and Do Not Go Gentle because I was looking at the women around the Anglo-Boer War. I wanted to create my own story of Salem witches, so to say, because if you read the book, you will see they work a lot with traditional medicine. But I think lockdown got me thinking because it felt like it was more, as I was writing it, it felt like it was more just about their lives. There was no sort of like a moving plot to see it starts from here and this is where it goes. And that's how I ended up with the character of Hans, who then leads, who sort of, threads the story to the end. I can see Alma is just like, Hans, no.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
we'll talk about Hans because I think that Hans
Yeah.
is an interesting character, but he's trashy, right? Like so
Right.
many men
Yeah.
like him.
He has to be
I
if
want
he's
to
been
talk about the
working
style
with.
that the book. Sorry.
Sorry, I was saying he has to have imperfections for the work he used to do.
Yeah, I mean,
No,
imperfection
that's
is an
true. That's
interesting
true.
choice of
Yeah.
word. Futhi. Imperfection is an interesting choice of word. I wanted to talk about the style that the book is written in. So there is a continuation. So you have the first person narrative, but you also then have the historical narrative that's brought through
Right.
by a number of recurring characters. So we
Yeah.
see Oma Kweki, we see Christina, there's a number of recurring characters, but the book in itself is written in first-person narrative, right?
Right.
And I want to talk a little bit about the style of the book. Why did you write the book in the way that you did, and what do you think would have been different had you not written it with the first-person narration and then the recurring historical characters?
Yeah, I actually tried a narrative voice. I tried a third person, but it just wasn't working. It felt stilted. And I think it was pushing me for my own growth as well to get into the first person. I was a bit nervous because, I mean, look at me and look at the character of an 8-year-old Hans. We have almost nothing in common except that we're South Africans. But as I went into it, it almost feels like a meditative state where you just go in and you just let the voice say what it has to say. And I think as chapters went on, I felt like, well, this could be done. I also could be Zoe Zondi at the same time, who was more familiar to me because her story is a little bit of my story, having grown up in the 80s with UDF and the violence that was happening there in Galuza around that time. So her part was easier. Hans was a bit of a pull.
But I think also what's interesting about the first person narrative, it feels like you're in someone's journal, right? So like there's a little intimacy that first person narratives create that I think a third person narrative would not be able to, because then it would be like this narrator looking into this world. But it felt for me, the power of the first person narrative was that in the moment that Hans was speaking, you were Hans, right? And in the moment that Zoe Zondi was speaking, you were Zoe. Or in the moment that Joseph was speaking, you were Joseph, right? So in many instances, it felt like you were like eavesdropping in an allowable manner with these characters, right? It felt, for me, it felt like there was a door open because of the first person narrative. It was like, I want you to be part of my story. And that's why I'm telling you. So I wanted to know, what are your meditations about that? Do you think that, like in many instances, it allowed you to achieve the intimacy with the reader in a way that a third person narrative was not able to do?
That's for sure. And I think that the lockdown where you have no stimulation outside, you are stuck at home. Well, I was stuck alone. So I had to, I actually, that's how it helped me to get into it, because there was no other distractions, to the point where you can almost visualize some of the things. You can visualize what was going on. And that helped a lot for me to actually be in that state of having no outside stimulation at all.
One thing that was really fascinating for me was this idea of like humanizing whiteness, right? I felt that like the book, like after I read it, I had to take a step back and be like, okay, hold up, what's happening, right? And I wanted to, pick your brain a little bit about that, right? About the idea of like humanizing whiteness in the context of this book, right? Because we think, everyone is the main protagonist, but we're introduced to Madala, who is Hans van Rooyen, right? And, and then we connect with Joseph at a later stage. And it's sort of like, in many instances, it's like there are these atrocities that Hans has created and which we will speak about, right? But for me, it was like, there was a commentary about like, and I was interested in you as a Black woman, right, growing up in the 80s, like this idea of humanizing whiteness, right, and like what your meditations were about that, to have Hans as sort of the foregrounding of the book and not perhaps Zoe Zondi, and was interested in that.
Yeah, I think for me, I was always curious about the people who were brutalizing people around the time of the 80s, well, even way before the 80s, in terms of what happens in their consciousness. Do they ever get to the point where they think of the things they did and the regrets that they have? Toni Morrison once was having an interview, and he was mentioning sometimes he wonders what happens when your ideas of superiority are dropped. That's where you actually, who are you without all these things? And I think for me, the main idea was to look into that and actually tear it apart to see how, where does it ever get to a stage where people face their regrets and actually face up to them and get a chance to actually verbalize it and say, this is what happened, because TRC didn't give us that.
I'm interested in the conceptualizations around reconciliation in this book, right? So we see that Hans seems to be somewhat contrite, but there isn't a full performance of that contrition, and I think that contrition is also an act, right? So in many ways, Hans continues to be problematic. So he refuses to go to the TRC, he doesn't declare at the TRC, he doesn't appear at the TRC, but then also has this Black woman then looking after him despite the nightmares and whatever is haunting him. And I think about the theme of reconciliation running through the book. Very few people in this book who seem to have harmed other people have perform full acts of what is necessary for reconciliation. So you think about Joseph and JJ and how that relationship almost gets mended, right? In many ways, the onus is on JJ to forgive. The onus is on Zoe and others to forgive old men like Hans, whose consciences may be haunting them, without them actually having to do a lot of the reparative work. And so I'm curious about your meditations around reconciliation and why the characters in this book participated in reconciliation in the way that they did, because you don't really see them have a reckoning with what they've done in the way that many white South Africans in this country have not really taken full ownership of what has happened. So apartheid is a thing that happened outside of them and that was orchestrated by other people, but there's no collective ownership of the violence that apartheid enacted upon Black people in this country. And so there's always this incomplete reconciliation, and so much of the reconciliation in this book feels incomplete.
I think it's interesting that this idea of forgiveness and reconciliation is a theme that gets picked up in the book. And for me, the interest was looking at this old man and not looking so much about him saying, please forgive me. Because it's a human story of an old man dying. And, there's no time between the two of them where Zoe, for example, says, I forgive you, and Hans saying, please forgive me, because I don't think it was so much about them getting into that finalization. It's more, I think my interest is looking at what happens in your short time before you pass. What are the things that are playing in your head? And for JJ at the end, it was more looking at the generation that's not walking around feeling like it's owed something. He's basically saying, I don't want anything that has to do with the Van Rooyens at the beginning, for example. And then the only time he keeps in touch with them is when he's at the point where he knows now he can work for himself and he can take care of himself without, I think there's this thing sort of like an expectation that, especially amongst young people, where you feel like you have to walk around feeling like you owe me something. He makes life for himself before he can go to them. So it's not like as if, he's joining them so that they can pay him something. And I think that's where I was trying to get into, not just in a black and white situation, but in a situation in general where you can't walk around believing that people owe you something, because I think that's a heavy thing to walk around with. I don't know if you get what I'm saying.
It's really interesting.
And I think that's interesting. Sorry to talk on a little, but I think that for me, what that leads me to is, for example, the familial context. There are things that Joseph owes JJ, and there are things that Hans owes Joseph, right? And I think that in the familial context, or in a relationship between father and son, or parents and child, that there are things that are owed. And I think of the relationships between the fathers and the sons that she wrote in this book, and I'm very interested in your exploration of the father-son relationship, which was flawed. I mean, there was a multi-generational flawedness in this relationship, and at every level we see the manifestations of what this flawedness looks like. And I wanted us to just speak a little bit about that, because I am interested. We've had a lot of conversations actually about mother-daughter relationships recently, but father-son relationships have not been explored yet. And there's like a particular narrative, right, about like absent Black father, angry Black son, and you go against the grain in this book in writing those father-son relationships, and I'm interested in that exploration and the exploration of masculinity that accompanies that.
And I think it's important for you to say that, Alma, because that's what I was going to say. I think also fraught in these father-son, parent-son relationships is also this idea of like toxic masculinity, right? I think that you look at the relationship between Hans and Joseph, for instance, and you think about the interaction that they had in the treehouse and how that was just like a display of like the most vile type of masculinity. Also like misogynoir, right? So like this hatred towards Black women specifically, right? But then you think about the relationship between Joseph and JJ, right? And when you think about Joseph and JJ, you think about the idea that like Joseph's reluctancy to see or to find or to seek or to try and reconcile is a reluctancy that is about masculinity. Effectively, it's like, I'm not going to allow myself to be vulnerable and be like, I messed up, right? And so I'm interested in that, like in how Elma is saying, we normally get these relationships that are written about in the Black context, but like you write against that grain and you write it in the white context. But I think also intertwined with that is this idea of like toxic masculinity, and this idea of like a very like specific type of performance of masculinity, right? That is also like sort of a hatred towards Black women in many instances.
Right. Yeah. I think we get into a loop in South Africa, this loop, especially the father and son, where sometimes you find the son saying, oh, all my things are not going well because my father is not around, or my father has not claimed me, or any of this. And I think I was trying to make sure that we get out of that loop. And that was through Tab Big Boy, who has these rituals that they make and makes sure that every boy there gets to understand that they have a belonging, and no one owes them anything. They can make their lives for themselves before, find their way of finding themselves before they go to a man they're going to claim as a father. So it's like initiating them into manhood that's healthy, that's not dependent on whether the father accepts me or not. It's a one where you go, not looking for, making sure you have your own independence before you can face this, find your manhood before you can face this man who abandoned you. And in terms of the hate against Black women, I mean, at that time, at that treehouse, this is what was happening to Black women. Black women were at the brunt of everything, from the Black men, from the security police, most of whom were white, from their comrades that they were with in the camps. So there's no getting away from it. I mean, I think if I were to try and make them anything else, it wouldn't be realistic for the story. So it's basically, with writing, you just place things as they were and make sure that people get to think. And I think we are lucky that we, at the time when now we can go back to these things and see them for what they were, because as much as it's happening now, I think we have a little bit more agency than at that time. There was no agency for them. It was existing, and put up with it, or find your exit. basically.
I want to speak a little bit about the black woman in the story and the way that the black women are written about in the story. You know, even in just daily discourse, there has been the idea of the mamification of black women, right? And it's like black
Right.
women consistently have to play a caregiver, a nurturing, a kind, a gracious role. And this is a stereotype that gets perpetuated all the time. So if you are
Right.
a black woman who chooses not to be nice in ways that make men feel comfortable and feel like they're being mothered, then you often get othered, right? You often get called names, etc. And then the black women in this book almost seem to be written in a very interesting lens. So these are women who've experienced a lot of trauma, who've
Right.
experienced a lot of violence, but who still fulfill that caregiving role, even to the people who've harmed them, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
I think about how Zoe Zondi has lost her parents to like apartheid violence, and Hans is somebody who perpetuates those kind of violences against people who look like Zoe, and yet
Right.
Zoe is a caregiver. You think about Christina in the story. Christina is a caregiver, and so there's this like running thread of the black women
Yeah.
characters in this book being caregivers and being nurturing, even to people who constantly expose them to violence. And I'm
Yeah.
interested in that, in why those women were portrayed in the way that they were
Yeah.
for the story.
Yeah. I think for Christina, there is no. Sorry.
Sorry, Futhi, before that, I feel like Alma is in my mind. I just want to say, I feel like Alma is in my mind. I was thinking particularly about this mamification of black women and thinking about a black woman poet in the US who writes a poem called What Looks Like Church on a Sunday Night, right? And in the poem, she says, which I thought was really interesting to think about the black woman in the story, particularly thinking about Zoe Zondi. She says, okay, so I'm just going to read part of the poem, right? She says, we are lovers of boys who are magic and disappear like our fathers taught them. We women who bring the bandages and the salt and the tears and the flowers. When there are no salt or flowers, we bring ourselves. And we unlearn every love every time that they are taken away. The chariots of blue lights or black bodies that always takes them away, don't they? But they don't see the wound it leaves in us, do they? They don't see the earthquake it makes in our wombs, do they? They don't see us drinking the blood and breaking the body, do they? To the woman, I need you to know that you are the hallelujah that lives on 93rd Street. You are third day rising in the morning. You are what home has always been. I see you. When you feel invisible, I see you. When the city is dark, I see you. And I have never beheld anything more beautiful. But I was thinking about this idea of like, when there are no flowers, we bring ourselves, right? This idea of like women constantly showing up, and you see this in a Zoe context, right? Like also in JJ's mother's context, right? These women are constantly showing up as black women. They have no time to coddle or nurse and mold and think
Yeah.
about their pain because they need to show up for our hands, right? They constantly
Yeah.
need to show up for our hands. And even in Zoe living and retelling her story, she's constantly the one who has to show up for these men, right? And I'm interested in that, right? Like this idea of black women always, always, always showing up. It's like black women don't have a break.
Yeah. And in real life, in our day to day, they're still showing up. They're now maids for the black middle class. They're maids for the white person. They're maids for the Indian person. They're maids for colored people. So it's not so much to mamify them, but to make sure the story itself is anchored into the reality. And with Zoe, what I tried to do, which I think is something I would want to do at some point, is that she's choosing to do this. She does it 6 months a year, and then 6 months a year she gets to travel and write. She found her own agency. And I think what she's doing is to continue with the family lineage, because you would see the grandmother, the mother were caregivers, were nurses. And most of us were raised by people who were either nurses, domestic workers, and so on. So it's something that's still continuing. And I think that although we're getting our education now and we're choosing different careers, but some careers are careers that are still ascribed to us as Black women, and that's what I was doing in the story. And for Zoe, I was also exploring the freedom. You know, she had the career as a nurse, but she also had a career as a travel writer, which shows that she's walking in the beating of her own drum, really, because this is what she does now. Basically, well, it's not that she volunteers because she gets paid, but she does it because she likes it. And then she travels because she likes traveling. And she has no boss, basically. This is what she do. If she does have a boss, it's for the 6 months that she's there, and then she goes and she does what she does. And she does basically almost what you're doing in that she's paid through the writing that she does. And so that's what I was looking towards.
I'm also interested in this idea of there seems to be the female characters in the book are closer to reconciliation and forgiveness, and this sort of authenticity of reconciliation and forgiveness than the male characters in the book, right? So you see Zoe and her friend, right, who reconcile, right, and who talk things through. And in talking things through, they come to a common ground to be like, okay, this is what happened and we're moving forward. But there's no that type of reconciliation. And I'm wondering if it's a commentary on like sort of this idea of like masculinity not being willing to come to the table and talking the things out, right? Because yes, you have said that it's about the end of life. But I think one thing that we take out from the book is that reconciliation between the characters, the broader reconciliatory project in South Africa is important themes. But it seems that the Black female characters in the book are able to reconcile easier than the male characters in the book.
Yeah, between Zoe and her friend, there was a story there. Remember, they didn't just abandon her to go. There was a story. There was the fact that the police were actually onto what was happening with Zoe, and when they saw, they had to leave her. And so, for me, I think that had to happen. They had to have that conversation for her to understand what had happened when they left her behind. And I think with males in general, in terms of actually sitting and saying, oh, I apologize for this and that, it hardly happens. And I think in this story, I don't know why, for some reason, it's something I didn't foresee, that it will be something about forgiveness. Because for me, it was just about this old man dying. I don't even think he was asking for forgiveness. And I think there was no part in the story where there is something where Zoe says, I forgive you, because it's such a large, the violence that happened to us was in such a large scale that I don't see it being something that can be sorted out in a conversation with two people. You know, that's why I wasn't even thinking in terms of looking at Hans saying, I apologize, but looking at his story, how the brainwashing started and how he ended up where he is, basically looking at how we create monsters by the stories that we tell, the narratives that we have. And his narrative was basically to say, I want to protect my country, and this is what he believed, until he actually got to work in a situation where it's now post-apartheid, and you have to work with young people who are completely different, people that you were actually brutalizing at some point. And so, I mean, even at the beginning, most of his story, it was like, I will die never having revealed what I've done. So I think most people are holding on to that. And I think a lot of people die without having revealed exactly what they did.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I've been thinking a lot about like this idea of white guilt. I feel that Hans in grappling, because for me, I think even though it's not an overt thing that you do in the book, I think a lot of what Hans is grappling with is this idea of reconciliation. Like, I need to tell the truth in order for people, for me to be release myself, but for the broader society to know that this is what I've done. But there's also this idea of white guilt, right? So Hans then post-apartheid becomes very soft and sort of is very protective of Black people in the way that he's not protective of white people. And it seems in many ways this is like little glimpses of him trying to get some form of redemption, right? And he's saying that I don't know how else to do this apart from not telling the truth. So I'm going to try and redeem myself and being this overly good white person and making sure that I protect these Black people in the academy. And I was interested in that, right? In how like struggles of reconciliation, because ultimately that is the point. It's like he's not being honest with himself about the atrocities that he's people, and how he's masking that is through this white guilt. And I was interested in that tension.
Additionally, before you answer, I mean, I'm interested in the conceptualization of white guilt as it relates to Hans. But there's also a thing that you do about the complexity of Hans, right? So yes, Hans is an individual, but he's at the end of life, and there's an exploration of the regrets. So I often think of this article I read about the regrets of people dying. And so they interviewed, I think, over 100 people who were at the end of life and asked them about some of their biggest regrets. And a lot of their biggest regrets related to their family. So it was less about what they had done, but more about what they hadn't done. So they hadn't cultivated relationships with their family. They hadn't been the kind of people that they had hoped they would be for their family. And so I want to layer that a little bit. That a lot of Hans's guilt, of course, comes from what he's done, but some of that guilt is also interlaced with what he has not done, because he may not have been equipped. If you look at the relationship he had with his father, he also was not equipped in the ways that many men in this country are not equipped to be functional parents and functional members of the family.
That's true, and that's why I couldn't get to the point where he actually has it out and say, please forgive me, because it's not languageable for him. It's not in his language. He's basically looking into unburdening himself without necessarily having to get to saying, I'm sorry, and I think not just him, I think a lot of people struggle with that word. It's a heavy word of saying, please forgive me. And they do what Hlaunen was saying in terms of making certain acts of, how do you say it, of showing their guilt. There is a word for this now, I can't think of it. Certain acts of trying to regain redemption of some sort. They volunteer, they do certain things, and I think as Black people, sometimes we pick it up that this is doesn't necessarily have anything to do with me, but it has to do with the person who's doing the acts. That they, if they give you a bursary, it's not so much about you as a person, but it's about unburdening and dealing with their own guilt or feelings of regret for the things they've done.
I suppose you can go ahead, Alma.
I want to talk about some happy moments in the book. I mean, the relationship between Zoe and her friend is beautiful. The friendship that they have, I mean, they are each other's chosen family. And there is a thing about the kinship that they develop, right? So you see them in the beginning sort of squabble over a boy, and I think those are the makings of a lot of teenage angst for friendships, right? But there is a beautiful moment where we see them come together and I guess have a family unit that is outside the conventions of like cis heteronormativity, nuclear family, right? They choose to parent this child together, and there's a thing about chosen family. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of that relationship, and what commentary you were making about the friendship between women, because we don't see any of the men in this book actually go on to have those kinds of depths of relations. But these two not only reconcile, but they also choose to become each other's chosen family.
Yeah. Well, they had to have a chosen family, otherwise Zoe will basically have no one. I mean, she tried to form a family on her travels, and that fell apart quite traumatically. And then she lost her family. And so she had no one. And I think for me, it was important that we show that sometimes you can be born with people who are not your family, but you linked with them for life. And I feel that these two were linked for life. I mean, they lost each other during the exile and all of that. But when they reunite, they actually reunite with the young Zoe named after the older Zoe, and with the man that they both loved having died, but now having this daughter through freedom. For me, that was basically showing that, and it does happen. We have these friendships in different settings where people who basically were childhood friends end up becoming family when they lose their own families. And Zoe's story around losing her father was very close to me, because I also lost my father in 2010. So I sort of got entangled there a little bit, and it was around a few months before the World Cup, and we actually had to watch the World Cup with my mom, the first match with my mom. And so that writing for me was a bit close to the bone.
I mean, I suppose when you speak about that, I thought that was like a really tender moment, right? That Zoe got to say goodbye, because I think many of us who lose our parents never get to say goodbye in that sense. We don't get to spend quality time with them, right? I think often about like losing my own mother. I was living abroad at the time, and I just got a phone call that my mom had died, right? So there wasn't even a moment or a time, or so I felt that was quite a tender moment in the book where so we could get that, right? Because so many of us like ex post facto, you know, after the fact has happened, we are the type of people who say, oh my gosh, like I wish I did this and I wish I did that, and I'm so glad that we got to do that. I'm also interested in another tender relationship, which is the relationship between JJ and his mom, right? I think like with all that was happening of JJ's conception and birth, right? JJ could have been another angry Black or non-Black person, right? And be like, oh my God, how dare this man not leave me? But I feel like the honesty, right, and the decision to speak to JJ and say to him, well, this is what happened, and I need you to know this is what happened, sort of also creates, like, for me, an interesting relationship about like mothers and sons, right? Because you know, oftentimes we may not know who our fathers are if we don't come from a nuclear family in the cis-normative sense, right? We don't know who our fathers are, but we are also afraid to have conversations with our moms about like who our fathers are, because we don't know what history belongs and what history does there. But I think you do something really tender in that moment, right? About like the place of honesty in parent-son relationship or parent-daughter relationship, right? That maybe honesty is the bedrock of meaningful relationships between children, parents and children, because often our parents say, no, I did it to protect you, but like, you could have told me and I could have made the decision about whether I needed that protection. So I wanted to speak about that tender relationship and what your commentaries have been about like what honesty can do for parent-child relationships.
Yeah. I think the generation that's now, I think we are more honest in terms of explaining to our children, you know, things that we may have been embarrassed at some point with. I think it becomes important to just say, this is what happened, and this is your father, and so on. But for me, what was I think what helped JJ a lot is Tab Big Boy, in terms of that ritual that he makes, and curbing his anger to say, you're putting yourself in fact, there is even a song, isn't there a song that says, you're actually putting yourself in jail by claiming, my things are not going well because I don't know my father, or carrying that anger. So yeah, I think the mother did the right thing for telling him and making sure that he understands where he comes from, and making sure that the choice is his, of whether to meet this man or not.
I'm interested in go.
Go ahead, Emma.
No, I mean, I wanted to talk a little bit about the language, right? Some of the language was quite visceral. So I think of Omahuki, right, who lives with Christina. And there's the relationship between them that you explore. But even in living with her, I don't know that there's a friendship. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, because can there be a friendship that exists when you have all of this unequal power, right? So you have all of these power dynamics. I mean, Omahuki really owes so much of what her household is to Christina, and she
Right.
can't even recognize her humanity. There's the K word being dropped, every
Yeah.
other way to describe Christina, and there's like a loss of humanity. And I think that there's something there about the ways in which, we conceptualize relationships in your home, which is so intimate, right? Your helper is in your home.
Yeah.
You expect
Yeah.
them to
Yeah.
clean your bathroom, but they can't use your bathroom. You expect
Yeah.
them to really inhabit such personal spaces, and can there be a closeness? And I wanted to get your feelings about whether you felt that there was a friendship between these women, when in many ways we've seen that even Omahuki's family cannot conceptualize the humanity of somebody like Christina.
Yeah. I don't see it as friendship at all. I mean, when Christina came, she was running away during the time of the Anglo-Boer War, and it's basically a relationship of necessity, if you think of it, and if you stay with the person for all those years, even if they're not family, they sort of there. And I think the mentality back then, I really didn't want to make it look as if they were family at all. But because they've lived for so many years together, it's sort of, as you say, it's almost like, I think at that time, they were almost seen as pets. It's almost like the pet of the house. He was there. She was there running away from this situation. But then, because she had been in this house for so long, and at that time also, you remember, Omahuki was getting quite old, quite aged, and there's that attachment. You get that attached even when she's told to leave the house, when the man of the house comes back. But also, I have to give it to Christina for, because even the title of the book actually came from her own strength, in terms of saying the brainwashing got to you too, so they got to you too. I think she had a strength of her own, and she had to make her own away from home, because she had to run away from home through the love relationship she had, having stolen her older sister's boyfriend, basically. So, I mean, she had to make her own. She had to have her own strength. She learned the midwifery skill, and their coexistence around the time of the war. I think what I wanted to do there was the survivor, where no one was more important than the other, if this one comes with this medicine, the others had to learn from it. And I was trying to make sure that, there was equality there in terms of the sharing of their knowledge for surviving in a time of war. In that story, you will see that, and in fact, that's where the whole mistrust around blacks and whites was happening, because of the gold that was, the gold rush that was happening around that time, and making sure that you divide and rule. Because the British, when they came, basically that was what was happening, to say, oh, now we're going to have classes in terms of you are the third class, you are the second better, and you are the landlords, the top of the top. So it was basically at that time, I think, showing that. But then she continued to live in this house. She continued to live in this family, and so they learned a lot together, and they aged together. And but I think if you were to go to the nitty-gritties, I don't think they thought of each other as equals, as you say.
I mean, before we open up for, if audience watching on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, if you have any questions or compliments or just something you want to say to Futhi, you're welcome to just, say chat, speak to us on the chat box, and then we'll spotlight it. I see Christina Miller, for instance, from YouTube has said, congratulations, Futhi, I love your work. And there's someone says, hello, everyone, Brazil is watching you. Hi, Futhi, congratulations. It's amazing to know that we are global. But Futhi, I wanted to know, I was particularly interested about the audience, right? So, James Baldwin also often speaks about the idea of, like, when he used to write books, he didn't write for a particular audience. But I wanted to pose this question to you. Who did you write this book for? Who did you hope would read this book?
Yeah, I think that's where I was going as well. I mean, sometimes when you write, you don't really know where a book ends up. And I think I got this question somewhere, and I was saying I've learned that books go where authors never thought they would go. You would think it will go to this one audience, and it ends up in different places. So I really, for me, my interest was the story. I wasn't looking so much in terms of who's going to be the main reader of the story. You
I was on mute. I wanted to know, what has some of the feedback been about the book, right? So what have you found? Have people received the story well? And I'm particularly interested because I say our earlier conversation about, like, humanizing whiteness, right? So people may be like, oh, why are we interested in another story about a white man who's da-da-da-da-da? So I wanted to know, what has the reception been about this story as a whole?
I think people were, one that came out that was interesting was somebody had said something about easy forgiveness, and which is something that you were also mentioning. And it's something that wasn't in my head, actually, when I was writing the story. It was more the human story and the regret of a dying man, basically. So that's been interesting to see, the reception of it. But I think I was also moved almost to tears when Mam Magona was mentioning the listening ear, because I think that's what I went with the most. And I wasn't resistant to it. I am the victim of violence during those days, and at the hands of the security police myself. But I wasn't thinking in terms of or maybe I've dealt with it, because I didn't think in terms of like really hating Hans and really sticking it to him. I could have quite easily made him a caricature and make sure that, you know, he meets his end in a way that's inhumane. But yeah, I guess I'm just not built that way at all. And so, yeah.
I mean, what's interesting is that the COVID-19 is like a looming figure in the story, right? So you see the isolation that comes with it, but you also see the ways in which
Right.
people are forced to inhabit each other's worlds that they ordinarily would not. So you have to spend the time you're locked down in this nursing home. And I'm curious about why you wrote that part in the way that you did, because I think there's something that COVID does, right? Or setting it in the COVID-19 lockdown does. Um, as it relates to almost there being an inescapability. So Hans can just not escape. I mean, we've seen that he tries to escape the past by, you know, entering the police force as institutional memory, as interacting with all of these people. But there are ways in which he just cannot escape. So there's an inescapability that COVID-19 and that lockdown setting allows. And I think that it's a metaphor for so much of the inescapability that happens in the book. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the history that we have is a history that we can't escape at all. And I think it plays out in different ways. I mean, it's symptoms that we have in the way we quickly get set off in certain ways. That, you know, if you see road rage, sometimes with white people, the K word is at the tip of the tongue. And a person would say, oh, I didn't mean it. I had just lost my temper and all of this. So these are the symptoms of an elephant in the room that we don't want to talk about. And I know that maybe the story comes across as trying to be too forgiving, but maybe it's my own way of dealing with the elephant in the room, because we have an elephant in the room. And I think if we were to deal with the elephant in the room by all being outraged, I'm not sure if we will ever get to a point where people sit down and talk about what had happened.
I want to talk a little bit about difficult conversations, because I think that
Right.
you seem to enjoy difficult conversations, even just the idea of the difficult conversation. So often there isn't a difficult conversation that takes place, but there is a premise of a conversation that must happen. So yes, we see the conversation between Zoe and her friend, which is quite difficult, right? Because you must explain why I was left behind. There's now a child that I need to hear about, who's the father of this child. There are many difficulties there, but there's also a conversation, for example, around mental health. We see Zoe's father, whose mental health really suffers under you know, this regime and the violence that he experiences under apartheid. And so there is this thread of like the need for difficult conversations, even if unspoken. There is a thing about the power of conversation and what happens in its absence. And I think it's so beautiful that you also alluded to that now in your response to the answer, because there are conversations that must take place, and I don't know that we can move forward without those conversations taking place.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know, I'm towards my 50s. So I remember with the TRC how many people were really left unsatisfied with that conversation, because if at some point it was one-sided, and at some point it was trying to cover and make nice of some of the things that happened there. And my thing is that as a nation, our psyche is not in order. Our psyche is kind of damaged. And I mean, there is work that's being done, but it's not, I don't think people feel safe enough. Maybe that's the word. People feel safe enough to have these conversations. but I do think that it is maybe even this book will start people thinking and discussing. I know I'm a bit of it will be two ways. For some, it will be, oh, it's too much forgiving to the whites. For some, it would be it's opened me up to thinking about things that used to happen at that time. If it does open that conversation, it's the beginning of something.
So I wanted to read some of the comments because I thought they were lovely. So Aisha says, looking forward to reading this. Futhi's writing's outstandingly good, as I've been saying to everyone in the bookish circles. Then Kendra Dean, all from YouTube, says, haven't read this yet, but I'm looking forward to it after watching this discussion. Such interesting and relevant points. Thank you, Futhi. And then we've got Maria. Futhi, I'm so intrigued by the story you've crafted and can't wait to read your book. Great to see and hear you on screen. I hope we'll see each other face to face before too long. And then we've got another comment from YouTube. Thank you for sharing, Futhi. So excited about reading and discussing this book. So important still for us to continue discourse on these topics. And so it seems like a lot of people are piqued by the conversation, which is always a good thing for the Cheeky Natives, right? Yeah. Because we want to pique people's interest and make sure that people are reading. But I mean, for us to say thank you, Futhi, for giving us the opportunity to discuss your book today, and thank you to Pan Macmillan for also giving us the opportunity. I mean, as you say, like, there's some people who are going to think about this book as an easy forgiveness, but there are also some people who are going to say this provides them a different perspective. And ultimately, I think books do that, right? Books allow us to...
both points are okay. You know,
books allow us to step out of our comfort zones.
That's for sure. Yeah. And I have to thank you guys for, asking the tough questions, because that's actually giving me a think as well, because I think you seem younger. I would just say you at the younger generation.
Yes,
and that's the generation.
We are very far from
and that's the generation I need to hear from. And I can tell that there is quite a bit that came out there that could be points of discussions.
So, Karen from YouTube says, thank you for do not go gentle, and now for your next book. This has been a fascinating and very layered discussion, much appreciated. And I'm also thankful for the audience members for saying this, right? Because ultimately what we try to achieve at the Cheeky Natives is not for you to have the, oh, Futhi, why did you write this? Where were you when you wrote it? Those type of books. We're really interested in, like, what are some of the themes that you were trying to uncover? And we hope that like these difficult conversations have been enriching to you, right? Because it also, I think, in your mind makes us know that we weren't reading the book at a surface level, right? We really were engaging with some of the things that you were trying to tease out of the book, right? So thank you again, Futhi, for being in discussion with us. And thank you for everyone who's joined us on this conversation. If you want to follow more of our work, please go to @CheekyNatives on social media. And also, if you want to follow, like, subscribe to our web podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google, Apple, or just type in the Cheeky Natives. And if you want to shop, just go to www.cheekynatives.co.za/shop. And then lastly, obviously, what's very important is you gotta get yourself a copy. A copy. No PDF, nothing. A copy, an actual.
And don't ask for proof copies. Go and actually get yourself a copy. But really, from the Cheeky Natives is to just congratulate Futhi. It's no small feat for a Black woman to have published 3 books in South Africa at the time that you have. And so, firstly, congratulations. We hope that this is number 3 of 30.
I hope so.
But also just to wish you well as you continue to write. I think that these are important stories that need to be told, and it's always interesting to have the intergenerational dialogue and to see the different perspectives. And I think that we've all been enriched by the conversation. So thank you so much to everybody who joined us. Please go get They Got You Too, but also go and get all of Futhi's other books as well. There are 2 other books. So you actually have no excuse. You need to go and buy all of Futhi's books. But we also look forward to more conversations on the Cheeky Natives. And thank you so much to everybody who joined us.
And have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, Futhi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.